Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for Advocacy and Messaging in an Election Year, the first of a series of webinars put together by the Office of Justice and Peace, Integrity of Creation at the Conference of Major Superiors of Men. I'm Tom Southard. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the conference, and I'm very excited to join you today. With me is Dr. Bethany Welch. Bethany is the Justice and Peace Fellow at the conference. She's been with us for about 4 or 5 months. And we're really excited to have her expertise with us as we talk about this topic. Very quick logistical pieces. We will have the presentation on the screen as we're talking. You'll be able to find on your screen a Q&A section. If you have any questions that you would like us to answer having to do with the topic, please feel free to reach out through the Q&A section. So we will be following those. There's also the chat function, which we've enabled. So if you have any resources you'd like to share, more broad pieces for the group, please feel free to share them there. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Bethany to get us started.
Hey, good afternoon, or yeah, I guess everybody's afternoon at this point in terms of the day. Welcome, we're very glad to have you. One of the things that I've decided as my tenure is unfolding here at CMSM is to offer some skill building workshops. So I think very often we are focused on the issues of justice and peace, which is essential, but the living out and the doing of the peace and justice is really rooted in a range of practices. And so today we're going to talk about advocacy and messaging, especially in an election year. So I don't know about you, but sometimes I have to put my Twitter feed away for a while to really just get a bigger sense of what's going on, because it can be easy to kind of have this narrow lens of what's happening. And so in an election year, things get tense, right? And so we thought this was a great time to just step back for a minute and to think about what is legal, what is permissible, what is best practice, and particularly within that charitable spirit of our faith. And so we bring this to you as a skill building opportunity, but hopefully also a chance for discussion and for you to weigh in on perhaps things you've seen or things maybe you would aspire to do or see done differently within folks that are caring about peace and justice and advocacy. Thanks.
Thank you, Bethany. So we're going to get started by talking about the legal pieces. The way we're going to focus today is the first part of this. We're going to talk about some of the legal issues, what you legally can and cannot do. What Bethany will then take it into is some of the good practices that we've seen and how we can make sure that we're doing them, sharing them, and helping to make an impact. And then we're going to leave a lot of time at the end for questions. That we don't anticipate this taking the whole hour. We really just want to give you information and then hear the information that you need. Again, the Q&A section is open. If there are areas that you would like more information on, if there are things that would be helpful to you, if there's something that's unclear, please feel free to join us. So inherently what we're talking about today is advocacy. And it's the idea of advocacy to support your mission. And advocacy can mean big, broad things, but basically it's how do we get support for the things that are important to us. And what we want to look at is the tactics. And each of these are important advocacy tactics or important pieces of achieving our mission to help people to understand the things that we're working on. It's the support of a cause. It's the support of a policy. And it includes lobbying. Often we hit advocacy, we talk about lobbying, we call it the end of the day. When people do advocacy trainings, the first thing that you usually see is a big picture of the US Capitol and you know, a bunch of little people walking towards it and hoping that they can make a difference. And that's a huge important part of this. But there's lots of other important parts of advocacy. It's the idea of coalition building, of online engagement, of education. Education can mean our decision makers, it can mean lawmakers, it can mean policy experts and analysts. It can mean the public. It can mean getting the public on board to understand what we're doing and why our mission is important. Legislative action, lobbying, can have a tremendous effect, but we don't ever want you to forget these other pieces of your mission as you're going on to it. Research to advocacy is an important part of what we're doing. Are our organizations creating the right research to be able to share? And we're going to focus on a little bit at the beginning these lobbying pieces and how they fit within an election year, the research and education pieces and how they fit within an election year, and why an election year is inherently unique for the nonprofit world. So 3 points to remember as we go through this. Number one, issue advocacy without limits on time, effort, and expenses. Our churches, our ministries, our religious institutes, and I am, for the purpose of this, we're just going to shorten it and call them religious groups, may engage in issue advocacy through activities like educating, mobilizing congregants and the general public to really understand issues, to be involved in issues. That is without limit. You can do whatever you want on educating and getting people engaged in these important pieces of the topic. Where we start to have limitations is around things like lobbying. And we're going to focus here on religious groups, meaning 501c3s. In a few moments, Bethany will talk about 501c4s and why they're a little bit different. Most of the people involved with us are 501c3s. If you're part of the Kennedy directory, if you're a church, a religious institute, one of those ministries in the official Catholic directory, you are a 501c3. There are narrow limits on your time, effort, and expense in which you can engage in lobbying. It's called the insubstantial part test. And the question is an insubstantial part of your ministry being used for these lobbying efforts? We'll get into a little bit of that in a moment, but you can lobby within a limited portion. And here's the big takeaway. We're just going to say it at the beginning, and then we'll talk more about how it works. You may not be involved in political campaign intervention, period. If you're involved with the Catholic Church, if you're part of the Kennedy directory, if you're one of our religious institutes, if you're engaged in this work, you may not get involved in political campaign intervention. You may do nothing that advocates for or against a candidate for public office. There's a lot of nuance that we're going to talk about, but we just want to say that right up front. You may not. You can all log off now if that's what you are coming here for. But we will nuance it in just a moment. So again, we talked about general issue advocacy. When you're involved in civil rights and civil liberties, economic justice, the environment, peace, pro-life issues, family issues, religious liberties, these issues, when you're getting the public involved, when you're working on these general issues in which there's not currently legislation pending, you may do whatever you want in that world in educating and getting involved. It becomes an issue that you have to start to pay attention to once, as I mentioned, once legislation is pending. At that point, it becomes lobbying. I know some of this is going to be simple for some of you. For some of you, it's going to be new, but we just want to make sure we kind of set the groundwork at the beginning. You have to use only an insubstantial part of your activities may be around influencing legislation. Now, what does an insubstantial part mean? That is, and I'm a lawyer by training, this is an area I worked in for some years, there's no real definition. People often say 3 to 5% of your funding, as long as it's not 3 to 5% of your funding. A lot of people will say, is that all you're known for? Is those lobbying efforts? That's when it starts to become an insubstantial part. But you can only do an insubstantial part of your work towards lobbying. And what is lobbying? It's attempting to influence legislation. So legislation has to be existing by people who actually can make the decision on it. So when you're contacting the public who can make the decision, when you're contacting lawmakers, or when you're contacting people who work for those lawmakers about the legislation, then it's lobbying. It's a pretty simple standard. You can do anything administrative. If you want to go to the US State Department and talk to them about religious liberty, nothing to do with lobbying because there's no pending legislation on those topics. It's only when you're there to propose, support, go against legislation that it becomes lobbying and crosses that line. And the one big important part, I always love to mention this part, is that if there's a public referendum on something, big if you're in California. I don't think any of our attendees are from California, but if you're out there, as soon as it's a public referendum, the entire public becomes decision makers. So you can't tell the public about things. Education suddenly becomes different if there's a public referendum that's on the table. Again, it doesn't include actions by executive, judicial, or administrative bodies. You can go to President Trump and you can try to get him involved in any topic that you want to. It doesn't cross that line into lobbying. Now, lobbying during election years, and we're going to say two things here, and I'm going to say something as I spent some time working closely with the IRS, and the rule that the IRS sets very clearly is that if it starts to look like lobbying in a campaign year that's a little bit different, they might come and have some conversations about it. More realistically, no church, I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to anyway, no church has ever had its tax exemption removed because of inappropriate lobbying or inappropriate political work. It just doesn't happen. But what it does is it breaks down trust in the churches. And I think it's really important to avoid that topic. It is illegal. Realistically, it just hasn't been much of an issue, but we do want to be aware because it is the law and we are called to follow the law. Close to an election, if you've never been involved in a topic and all of a sudden you decide you're going to be involved in a topic and it's really closely aligned with one of the political parties, that starts to look like lobbying into campaign intervention. So if you have never done any work on anti-war efforts, and your first foray into anti-war efforts is 3 weeks between the election of one person, of a real war hawk and a dove, it's going to start to look like you're only going in for that purpose. So you really want to avoid that. But if this is something you've been doing, if this has been an area that's been of import to your group for a long time, it just continues to be normal lobbying during an election year. It just happens to be during an election year. I do want to say what we're talking about mainly is federal law. State laws are all different. So if you start to move into state law, you'll want to look into what the state laws are that allow it. But generally, lobbying, the right to lobby for nonprofits continues to be protected by the First Amendment, which has been upheld through the Supreme Court up into 2009. So we're pretty solid that these are things that will be allowed at the state level also. Now, political campaign activities is where all of a sudden there's a big bright line. You may not participate in, intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. This includes contributions, public statements of support, and public statements of support could be written, they could be implied, they could be inferred. You want to avoid anything that is going to make it sound like you are only there to endorse a candidate. Individual activity by religious leaders is okay, and they can do it as long as they don't identify themselves as being representative of that religious body. So every year, there are a number of religious leaders who will come out and support a president. It doesn't happen as much in the Catholic Church. Often in the Catholic Church, we find it's a little bit more, we just lean ourselves those ways, right? Our religious leaders aren't that transparent about it. They're a little bit more opaque in who they support, but you will never see Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York City, who is supporting Donald Trump for president. That will never happen that directly, because that's not allowed and it's not appropriate. And Bethany will talk a little bit about at the end. It's not allowed by the Catholic Church, but also it's not allowed under the federal tax law. Both important. So that just isn't going to happen. It happens a lot less. We see it in a lot of Protestant churches where they will come in, and Bethany was just reminding me of this before the call. We'll see it in Protestant churches where you'll invite in a candidate, and the minister will say, this is the person that you should vote for. Our liturgy doesn't necessarily allow for that in the same way that Protestant services do. So it's not happening as much in our churches. But people do start to walk an interesting line. We just recently had the issue of the priest who came out and said, and I'm sure this is at the top of many of your minds, who came out and said, you cannot vote for Democrats if you're Catholic, right? It is an evil party and you can't do that. And then we had the bishop who came back and said, please don't say that, right? In a number of reasons, please don't say that. And part of that is that the way he was writing it, the way he was doing it crosses that line. It crossed the line in a lot of ways, but now it's something that has become a national issue that people have to address. Religious groups have to avoid any issue advocacy that functions as political campaign intervention. This is exactly the issue we were just talking about. A priest, again, by tax law, cannot stand up and say you can never vote for a Democrat. Because that, again, moves into the idea of issue advocacy. If they separate themselves from the church, if it's done not from the pulpit, if it's done using their title only as an identifying situation, if it's not done of saying, Father Bob is the pastor of blank, and this is the role that church takes, that's very different than, Father Bob, and underneath it might say, and you'll see this all the time from foundations and big nonprofits, that will say, John Smith has supported this, and for informational purposes only, he is the executive director of whatever it's going to be. Again, we don't see it as much. Part of it is, again, the Catholic piece against political intervention to that degree, but it does go against tax law. So when we start to figure out if we're moving into political intervention, which is, again, what we want to avoid, and again, I'm giving you the law, we'll move into some of the tactics as we go forward. What the IRS considers is whether the statement identifies one or more candidates, for a given public office, whether it expresses approval or disapproval at a specific position or action. I want to be clear, this is a facts and circumstances test. This doesn't mean that you go through and check them all, and if you hit one or if you hit all of them, it is that, but these are the questions they're going to ask. So for instance, we say whether the statement expresses approval or disapproval for one or more candidates' positions or actions. You are going to see, and we have been seeing, a number of statements that come from groups like the USCCB or that come from religious institutes that will say, these are really important to us, right? Pro-life issues are really important to us. And we are going to talk about all of the issues of life. And when we talk about the issues of life and we balance it, it's going to include all of these issues, which inherently are going to fit within some of the campaign pieces. We can't totally avoid that, but it all depends, again, on how it's done. Are we specifically delivering the statement close to the election? Are we making reference to voting or an election? When you start to say, remember, election day is next month, and a reminder that we as Catholics only vote, against racism, right? You put those together and all of a sudden you start to have these different conversations. Whether the issue addressed in the communication has been raised as an issue distinguishing candidates for a given office. So when you have a specific issue that, if the big conversation is continually on the war on drugs, right? And then all of a sudden, the day before the election, you come out with a position on the war on drugs, that starts to look like it's skirting that line. An ongoing series of communications as opposed to this one independent communication. This actually came up at one point some years ago. There was a group that was a group that had to do with drug abuse, and I can't remember exactly what the group was, but they always did these statements, and they did very nice statements over any cycle of a year, and then all of a sudden in the weeks leading up to the election, they started putting big American flags at the top, and they started putting, and you knew exactly who they wanted you to vote for, but they started making it very America. And essentially the IRS said, we don't like it, we're not doing much about it, but it does start to skirt to that point of we're now tying our issue directly to the election, which is what we want to avoid. And whether the timing of the communication, again, goes to that scheduled vote on specific legislation by an office holder. So if you have a sitting US senator who is running for president and there's a big vote that's coming up and all of a sudden the entire focus is on that vote, then that can, again, start to look like this issue. So these are some of the sample factors that you'll want to consider. Again, I want to say it's a facts and circumstances test. You don't read this and check it off. You just look at it and say, are we generally doing this the correct way? Are we protecting our tax-exempt status? That's an important piece of this. It's allowable to work with candidates, including in an election year. And the main ways those typically are done is candidate forums, right? You're all familiar with having a candidate forum. And to do a candidate forum, you have to invite both candidates, and you have to, or as many candidates as there are, and you have to invite them in a timely fashion. So there was a situation some years ago in the state of, I'm pretty sure it was Maryland, where they had 3 candidates for governor. They had the Democratic candidate, the Republican candidate, and the Green Party candidate. And they invited the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate to a candidates forum that was around issues of healthcare in Baltimore City. And they forgot to invite the Green Party candidate, so they didn't invite him until 2 days before. It becomes an issue of, was he unfair? Did they advantage, did a nonprofit advantage the 2 main party candidates and leave out the Green Party candidate? And realistically, they did. And it was a mistake, but it was an embarrassing one that didn't need to happen. And again, it starts to there look like you're taking away the equal opportunity that everyone has. A brief aside here to say, if there is a sitting, if there's somebody sitting in office, an incumbent, you can invite them in their official capacity to join. So, if there's a US senator who's running for president, but that US senator has been really involved with the grants of your organization or whatever it is, they can still come as the US senator separately, but now you have to work very diligently to make sure that it's not a campaign rally, that it doesn't feel like that it doesn't, recommend him, that it doesn't celebrate him for that, but rather that he or she is just part of the dialogue around the work that they've done with that group. So it is allowable, but it is something to be aware The other part, and this really, we only see this a lot in Catholic colleges and universities, any good service or facility must be available. So often we will have sometimes it happens at the local level in some parishes, where you'll have candidates who will say, you know, we'd like to rent out your hall, we'd like to rent out your stadium, we'd like to rent out something for a rally. And all of a sudden you have the Joe Biden rally at Christendom College. And you have to kind of walk through that issue of is Christendom celebrating Joe Biden, or are they just renting out the space? Often what I've recommended as a tax attorney is that if a candidate comes and wants to rent out your space, that you send a letter to the other candidate and say, we just want to let you know this person has rented out our space. It is at a fair market value. It has to be at a fair market value. And we would like to give you the same opportunity. If you would like to rent out our space, here's the cost, just let us know. We're happy to have that conversation. Again, it gives you kind of that protection of making sure that no one is being treated non-civilly, that there's an equity to how they're being handled. And we're just gonna hit this quickly. Don't worry about everything that's on the screen. The IRS treats Facebook, Twitter, emails, websites, the exact same as they treat printed materials, which is all the things that we've talked about. So if you're going to put something out there, advocating, if it's going to be lobbying, if it's going to touch on some of these issues, make sure that you know that what you're putting out there virtually has to follow all those same rules. It starts to become interesting. You'll find a lot of people on Twitter who are very active on Twitter, who are in these nonprofit organizations, will say something like, I'm not speaking specifically for my organization, right? They separate themselves a little so they can continue to be politically engaged. But we all know a number of people who are politically engaged on Twitter who represent an organization. There's a question, and I'm going to allow you to talk. Brian, you can unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry, I guess I was just kind of testing things out. But what I wanted to ask is, you know, it seems to me like political propaganda would get really murky. For instance, the young man in Washington, D.C., who, you know, goes to a Catholic high school and wore a MAGA baseball cap in public. I think that gets really murky as to, is the school endorsing Donald Trump? So could you speak to that at some point?
Yeah, so from a legal perspective, it's not a problem because there's no one in the tax world who would look at that person and say, a 17-year-old boy speaks for the Catholic school, comma, and this is where you have to get into Catholic school issues. The moment somebody walks out from the Catholic school with this specific hat on or doing this specific thing, they suddenly speak for the whole Catholic Church, right? That's the news story that follows. So I would say, from a legal perspective, entirely acceptable. If there had been a teacher wearing it, it starts to get a little murky. That would probably cross a line. You know, if the principal or president is wearing it, again, different line that suddenly becomes crossed. But, you know, a group of boys who are wearing it together, no legal issues, total public relations nightmare, as we've all seen play out in the last year and a half. Has it been that long? I guess it has. Does that?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
While we're here, would you also answer the question in the panelist chat? So the question is about sending out a legislative action alert.
Yeah, so thank you. Legislative action alerts. I'm apparently missing a chat somewhere. There's a lot going on the screen. So legislative action alerts are, again, acceptable and they become lobbying. So the question is, have you been doing this type of lobbying regularly over time? If you have, again, totally acceptable, keep going for it. If all of a sudden you send out your first legislative action alert on October 26, 2020, and it is entirely about issues of something that's related to the campaign, I feel like either way I go, I'm going to pick somebody, right? The world is so murky right now. Then that starts to become a little bit more, murky of is this an issue? So we love legislative action alerts, obviously. CMSM sends them. Many of you people send them. Our ministries, we're very happy to get them and to be engaged with them. But don't choose October 2020 to start them. Great. And so yeah, so Facebook, Twitter. Oh, one word of caution: anything you post online lives outside of your organization if you're linking out. So Bethany was actually just reminding me the USCCB does a wonderful job of when you link to when you click a link that goes outside of the USCCB's website, there's a big pop-up that says you're now leaving the USCCB's website. Are you sure you want to go? And it's that good reminder that this is now not our content anymore. If you're linking to a candidate page or an organizational page, you have no idea what that's going to say a day from now. So, you know, it may be like, here's a really nice platform we like, and the next day it says, you know, death to all. Like, we just don't know what that's going to look like. So you just want to be aware before you link out that you have real trust in the organization. Again, it's attenuated enough, it doesn't become a legal issue, but I think if we've worked, for those of us who have worked in advocacy long enough, I'm sure you've all seen this happen, and we just be careful. And this is going to be my last one before I hand it over to Bethany. Voter education is totally allowed. And in fact, voter registration and voter education has a great long history in the Catholic Church. We have, you know, wonderful stories over the past 100 years of Catholic priests, brothers, sisters, ministries, lay people who have been involved in this work. So love it, but you just need to make sure that you're nonpartisan. And that's really the takeaway here. We've talked about what nonpartisan is. You can focus on communities of size, you can focus on people who are interested in a specific topic, you can focus on any of that. But the moment you start to hit the idea that, you know, we're only registering you because you will support X candidate, it starts to, again, be a little murky, and we want to try to avoid that. I say murky, it actually becomes opaque, just don't do it. So that's, yeah, we love voter registration, get out the vote drives, right? Drive people to the polls, beautiful, because that's part of helping them to celebrate democracy. Just make sure that it's not inherently partisan.
Okay, so this is me. What I want to do is just illustrate a few of the things that Tom has been sharing with kind of concrete, practical examples. So kind of picking up on the voter registration, the USCCB has actually some wonderful resources that are accessible for all the different Catholic entities in the US. And it highlights this idea that parishes are some of the few institutions that can reach groups at the margins. So we know that many, for example, of our second language communities in the United States are served so capably, right, by men and women religious, either from the home country or who are missioned and speak that language. And so people trust, right? There's a certain element of trust in your local parish, which can be a great way to engage people around the civic aspects of being in the United States. Sometimes it can also raise questions about voter status. And so someone might be newly naturalized and not know what the next steps are. And so parish voter registration campaigns can be really important. And again, thinking about it in election year, I included a photo here from our friends in El Paso. St. Mark Catholic Church did a recent voter registration drive just last week or so while they were doing a really large distribution of food around the COVID crisis. So they took the opportunity to go car to car safely, socially distanced with the mask in order to check in with folks and just see while they were waiting in line for food. And I didn't include the other photo, but it's about 200 cars in line for food. And just really, you know, taking that practical, meet the person where they are opportunity. And we have a new bishop in Diocese of Baltimore, Bruce Lewandowski, who's also a Redemptorist. And one of my first projects ever as a parishioner in North Philadelphia with him was a voter registration drive and then a subsequent Get Out the Vote project. And so when he was being, you know, considered to be elevated to bishop, particularly as a younger male religious, it was really exciting to me that the folks in Baltimore would have someone in that position who understood the really practical nature, not only of voter registration, but of all aspects of advocacy and civic engagement, not just on this national level where we go to, you know, big lobby visits, but really in the day-to-day and the day-to-day living of our faithful citizenship. Okay. One of the other things I think that is really exciting is the way that men and women religious can do advocacy and serve in various roles that directly intersect with public policy. One of the very first, so I'm an adult convert to the Catholic faith, and one of the first women religious, actually the first one I ever met, was a policy director for an elected official, which is pretty edgy and would still be edgy now some 25 years later. But she was worked on domestic policy and specifically on issues around hunger relief. And I was a young intern in a college internship with a hunger relief organization. And I was just really struck by both her commitment to her charism and to her community, but to her living that out in a public policy role. So I included two pictures here. One is on the top of the sisters who run the Respect Life office in the Archdiocese of New York. They are, in fact, Sisters of Life. And so they're functioning, right, in kind of roles that really represent advocacy issues, but are also, very practical and spiritual at the same time. The lower picture includes both a woman religious and a priest. And this is an immigration advocacy day organized in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And so this was something that was organized statewide. It was kind of an inter-coalitional work, so it wasn't just people of faith, but the Archdiocese of Philadelphia had resources available to help support localized groups. And so these two, the men and women religious, are attending and accompanying mostly undocumented immigrants from a parish in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And so again, very practical accompaniment, but also the ability to go and to hopefully influence some of the decision-making with seated elected officials rather than in an election year. The other thing that, I think is really important to think about is, as a person of faith or as a leader, whether you're a religious or not, candidates may come and ask you for advice or insight on the particular constituents that you serve. So I can think of, for the last almost 8 years, I have worked before this position, worked at a parish, and I had a woman who was going to be running, she was putting a campaign together, an exploratory campaign for the state of Pennsylvania to run for a position, a representative position. And so she met with me early on as a parish outreach worker to just kind of hear what the needs and issues and concerns were of our largely immigrant and refugee community. However, once she won the election, or actually when she was campaigning, she would regularly ask me to come to events, to be in photo shoots. And that was not something that was appropriate in my role with the title that I had as a parish employee. So I think that distinction is important. You can advocate for individuals, you can work on advocating around actual issues, but when it comes down to the individual elected officials, there are, or in a campaign, there's more nuance there that we want to keep in mind. All right, so one of the things I wanted to do was also put this idea of Catholic advocacy in sort of the larger landscape of what's going on nationally. So this is from, there's two slides with information from this research study by Pew Research Center Forum on Religion and Public Life. It is from 2012, so it's the last data available, but you can see in the slide that after interreligious collaborations, Catholics represent the largest group in DC that have a presence, right? And a presence not just around legislative advocacy, but it could be around judicial issues. It could be on individual, kind of issue-based campaigns. Could also be on research. And so I think sometimes we forget in our conversations around advocacy that it's not just legislative action, right? There are conversations that are being had that could have an advocacy component, or the data being collected, generated, and analyzed could support advocacy efforts. So you'll see on the slide here that it mentions, an organization like CMSM or LCWR, and then other organizations as large as Catholic Charities. So there's, we're up there, right, in terms of the work that we're doing across the country and being based in DC. Okay, so one of the big distinctions, and one of the things I wanted to make sure was in this presentation, is this distinction between the C3 and the C4. So as Tom said, most of you are in organizations that are a 501c3. The group exemption with the USCCB makes it a little bit muddier, but there's another option if you wanted to get more into lobbying, or if you see someone who has posted something that seems, a little bit more political than you might be comfortable with. It might be that they have a C4. And so a C4 is organized specifically to get into that realm, right? Around education, lobbying, and political activities. The thing that's really important is that the contributions are not tax deductible. So this is not serving, a public good in the same way that your after-school program or soup kitchen is doing. This is really to change policy. And so that money needs to really be treated in a different way. It also allows people to be, more aggressive, more assertive, to change the positions of politicians. So not just, on an issue, but really the person either running for office or in that office. And so the C4 really then has an obligation to make it very distinct about where someone is spending their time on the staff, where the money is being collected, how it's being reported back. And so it's essential. Boulder Advocacy has some great resources on that, and I included the link, but just for the purposes of our conversation, to recognize that distinction between a C3, which again, most of you probably are, and then a C4, which is, not just organized separately, but has financial and legal commitments that look different than what you might be involved in as a JPIC coordinator, as a superior, et cetera. All right, so when it comes to the same collection of organizations in DC, you'll see that the distribution is really by and large to the 501c3, right? The majority of folks are doing some education, some basic advocacy and lobbying on a range of issues as organizations of faith. A small number have a C4 only, and then a portion have both. And so I want to give you an example of some organizations that do both. So immigration reform, that's an area I've spent a lot of time in. Immigration reform groups, as they become more sophisticated in their campaigning, often recognize that kind of society's outlook, and you'll see this now often more so with Black Lives Matter as well. People are thinking about a particular issue and they're thinking about social change, and they're recognizing that maybe one way to achieve that is to look at having people run for office. So putting folks in seats that look like more of America. So the Latino Victory is a 501c3 that created a separate C4 called the Latino Victory Project. And they're really focused on cultivating, supporting, and financing Latino leaders at every aspect of US governance. So it could be the city level, could be the state, could be national. So that money's set aside, it's run differently, it's reported on differently. New Jersey, the Working Family Alliance, is a C4, and they were focusing on ballot measures. So in the state, not actually in the state, but in cities, Trenton and Montclair, they were looking specifically at paid sick leave for largely marginalized individuals. But again, doing that in a very different way than kind of the person who's writing the legislative action alert or who has a candidate forum. This is a much more sophisticated and also has a greater level of accountability to your donors. Okay, so here's an example, probably one you might be familiar with, and apologies if you already know this, but I thought it was important to point out. So Network is an organization based in DC that has both a 501c3 and a 501c4. And you can see on the screen that the lower left-hand side of both of their web pages has hyperlinks to two separate websites technically. So you have Network Lobby and you have Network Advocates. And the content appears similar, but it does have some distinctions and differences. My assistant, there we go. So one of the things you can see on the lobby, which is the C4, it has questions. So here's a very simple question. Is my donation tax deductible? It is not. And so there's the distinction there. The contribution to Network Advocates are tax deductible to the extent allowed by the law. These other ones, which are really being explicit around politics, are different. And so here's something where, I think as we've gotten into this issue and this topic, this election season, as people are coming forward more explicitly with their political views, recognizing also that political isn't partisan, right? Those are two different things. And so wanting to say that there are these tools for Catholic organizations, for men and women religious, to think through, what is the best path forward? For those of you for whom, charity and kind of social outreach is a distinct platform, it's going to look different than folks who say, we're really thinking about systemic issues or we're thinking about policy change. When I sat down to think about today's activity and gathering and just reviewing my thoughts of being involved in this as a nonprofit manager, as an administrator, as a voter, I also thought of some of my very first experiences with lobbying, which were with the Right to Life movement. So I grew up Protestant and my family was very involved in the Right to Life movement in the 80s, but we always went to the local Catholic parish. And it was really the only time we interacted with Catholics, or even were allowed to. And so much of my early, sort of 7, 8 years old is kind of sitting underneath the pew we always had these like tote bags of coloring books and stuff while my parents were in meetings. And similarly, around the homeschooling movement, my parents were very involved in lobbying and advocacy for changing New York state laws. And so I think there's this unbelievably great witness, right, of being engaged as a person of faith on issues that affect your family, your individuals, your communities, your institutes, but also those who don't have a voice. And so again, not to be things to be concerned about or confused about, but tools and opportunities to really build the kingdom of God in a way that is accessible and appropriate for our day and our time. Our last slide is a picture, or is a quote. And again, sort of, I didn't need to say this, Pope Francis can say it instead, but this is Pope Francis addressing the US legislature several years ago. And so, I don't know, it says 2013, shouldn't be that. Anyway, really that we're intended to be involved, right? We're intended to be engaged in the life of our communities in a variety of ways. And so you as leaders have different responsibilities than those of us who are perhaps participating as individuals. All right, that's me.
So I think, this has been the presentation. We do have some time left, and we're happy to take questions. And there are 2 ways you can ask questions. Please feel free to type them in the box if that would be helpful. I realize that I don't have the question box in front of me, so I don't know if I've been missing them. My apologies if I have. Or feel free to raise your hand, and we can allow you to talk and to ask your question. We're happy to do that now. So we will give you a few moments for questions. If anybody wants to join in, or stories. I mean, we're happy to hear what has worked for you or what hasn't worked for you. For some of you, this is totally old hat, and you've got expertise in this, and hopefully we've given you something. For some of you, this might be a little new. We're happy to hear from you either way. Thank you, Marianne. We'll give it a few more moments. Again, if you have anything that you'd like to ask, please, now's a good time to do it. I want to say that, for policy and I was a professional lobbyist for some time. Bethany has been a lobbyist by necessity, I think, over the years. Very different approaches. And neither is more important. And some of you, I recognize some of the names of people who are in the room. Some of you are professional lobbyists, and some of you are lobbyists by necessity. And we are happy to. I think that both of those are very important, and both of those approach this very differently, right? Because there's the view of how it needs to be done, of the timeline, and it's not always easy to do this, but there's a lot of rules. But I want to go back to what we said at the very beginning, which is that lobbying is an important part of advocacy. And at the end of the day, advocacy is getting people to understand your issues. So we hope that you'll consider ways to get people involved in your issues. And Bethany is a resource for you as our Justice and Peace Fellow. If you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, please feel free to reach out to her. We didn't put her email up here, but Bethany will type it into the chat, so you will have it there. Please feel free to reach out to her if you have anything else. And if you have questions about the rules, that was the old webinar that I used to give in another life, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to support you. I just realized, as a terrible attorney, I forgot to say the important thing I was supposed to say at the very beginning of this, which is this is not legal advice. This is just what Bethany and I have understood to be the rules. So we both have experience. We're happy to share it with you, but technically neither of us are giving legal advice right now. So with that, I think we will close ourselves out.
You want to put up the other slide? We have one last slide.
We need to close us out with this.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So again, in the the idea of skill building workshops is that we would have a variety of things this fall and hopefully into the spring as I continue in this role. So our next webinar will take place towards the end of October, and it's really focusing on the what's next around anti-racism. So many of us spent the summer reading books, participating in talk series and a lot of different learnings, and are now, on committees or in groups and thinking about, how do I help my community, my institute, my college, my high school live this out? So what are those policies and practices that are the next step? So we are going to have the wonderful Dennis Okema, who is Director of Diversity Inclusion at Cristo Rey, Philadelphia, a really longtime advocate in peace and justice, especially with human rights sites in Uganda and Rwanda, and more recently here in the United States. And so he is really adapting a lot of what he has learned in the international and the developing world space and bringing it into some of the work that he's doing here in Philadelphia and then the region. I'm saying here because I'm here in this area. And so really, you know, hopefully giving us some both really concrete examples, but also ongoing skills and things to be thinking about for our organizations in the really long work to make our organizations more inclusive and engaging, and also recognizing a long history here in the United States of really difficult decisions and unfair practices. So I'm hopeful that you'll register for that. We'll get a link out for that soon. We're also going to have a book group that's going to, I thought I brought it, but it's not here. The Massengale book for people that are interested in a book discussion, and Brother Ernest will be involved with us as well on that. So again, thanks for your time today, and I hope you consider some of our other justice and peace options in the weeks and months to come.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We're grateful for you joining. Best of luck.